Hello, folks, and I hope you're having a good week off and that your paper's going well. So, when we last checked in, we were dealing with Aristotle and him teaching Alexander the Great. But before we get to Alexander, we have to talk about Alexander's dad, Philip of Macedonia. Macedonia is to the north of Greece. The Greeks have always had a problem with Macedonia. For the Greeks, Macedonia is like West Virginia is to Virginia. Greeks look down on it. They see the Macedonians as being uncouth and uneducated. And even today, there's a huge thing that goes on between the former Yugoslavian Macedonian nation and the Greeks. The Greeks literally try to prevent them from using that term. So Philip of Macedonia was the youngest son, but over time he finally inherited the kingdom of Macedonia and began its expansion. And as you can tell, the coin up there shows what he wanted to look like, and the reality is on the bottom. Philip launched a series of wars and conflicts, and over time he defeated basically every single Greek city-state or made an alliance with them. Eventually, it came down to Macedonia and Sparta. And interestingly enough, Sparta was the one nation he didn't conquer because he sent a letter to the Spartans saying, if you do not go with me and you choose to fight me, I will destroy you. And the Spartans responded with one word, if. And Philip decided not to. Philip's ultimate goal, even though he, from a Greek perspective, was not a Greek, was to basically have revenge and eliminate Persia. Unfortunately for Philip, this set him up for disaster. And in 336 BC, he was assassinated. Philip's son was Alexander the Great. Alexander lived from 356 to 323. Now, I say Alexander was Philip's son, but Alexander's mom liked to claim that in fact Zeus was Alexander's son, and thus Alexander was a demigod. Whichever way you want to go, Philip was smart, and he recognized that if he was going to actually control Greece, and then Alexander was going to control Greece, Alexander needed some legitimacy, and he got that through Aristotle, who taught Alexander up until the time he was 16. And of course, if you think about it, Aristotle is only 2 times removed from Socrates. So Alexander is steeped in these classical Greek ideals. And he is also the warrior son that his dad would want him to be, except Alexander truly earns the term of great based on what he is able to accomplish. This is just a brief slide showing you his route and all that he managed to do. He went after the Persian Empire, eventually killing Darius III. Having seized all of the Persian Empire, he then decided to take over Egypt. This is where he founded Alexandria, though in fairness, during his life, he founded over 20 towns named Alexandria. He then decided he wanted to conquer the edge of the world and go to the Great Sea. And this led him eventually to Afghanistan, through the Khyber Pass, and into India. Eventually, his troops basically said, Alexander, we're really sick and tired of exploring the world. We're Greeks. We want to go home. And so Alexander began to head back, and in Babylon, he died. Now, he was 31 years old. And if you think about having conquered most of the known world by the age of 31, supposedly Caesar, when he saw the tomb of Alexander, wept because he realized he would never accomplish as much as Alexander had. These are just several images of Alexander from the Middle Ages, from the Muslim world, just showing how this man's legend lasted long after he and many of the people who he had fought with were long gone. This is actually the tomb of Alexander. It was placed in Alexandria, Egypt. This is where Caesar wept. And after he died, almost immediately, because he was 31, no one knew what was going to happen to his empire. Eventually, 4 of his generals divided it up. Cassandra took Greece, Lysimachus took Thrace, Ptolemy took Egypt, and Seleucus took the old Persian Empire. It was logical kind of to divide it up this way. But what's interesting is that even though Alexander's empire fell apart very quickly, culturally it would last for a much longer time. Interestingly enough, Ptolemy, probably the most famous of the 4 generals, takes Egypt. And you can see on the bottom Ptolemy's image as a Greek, and up top Ptolemy's image as an Egyptian. Ptolemy and his family will embrace Egyptian culture as previous invaders have done, and in fact, probably the most famous Egyptian queen of all time, Cleopatra, was actually one of Ptolemy's descendants. So she wasn't Egyptian at all. She was actually Greek. Another interesting legacy of Alexander can be found in Greco-Buddhism. Yes. The Greeks who were in Afghanistan after Alexander died stayed. And in fact, there's Greek influence in Afghanistan and in Buddhism in Afghanistan into the 3rd century, which is pretty amazing. And you say, what? Well, this statue kind of shows it in the way that this is classical Greek drapery on a statue of Buddha. Another influence that this kind of Hellenistic age had was in art and sculpture. The Greeks were exposed to different ideas about what the body should look like and how it could be posed. On your right are 2 statues from the classical period of a woman and child. They're beautiful. The drapery is amazing, but they're very kind of static. On the left is the statue of the Laocoon. If you remember, he was the priest who attempted to warn the Trojans that the Trojan horse was a bad thing. The way the priest and his sons are displayed in the sculpture would not have happened in the classical period. This is not the kind of sculpture that an Athenian would have made or paid for. But in the Hellenistic period, it became much more acceptable to show emotion and express yourself. Probably the most famous thing that came out of the Hellenistic period was, of course, the Great Library of Alexandria. This was an attempt to create the largest known library of everything. And the Greeks at Alexandria went out and reached every single part of the world and basically said, we want to know about you. It was an amazing research institute. It was on such a level that literally they reached out to this very small tribe living in Palestine who believed in one God. And they said, we want your material. We think you're kind of nuts, but we would like to have copies. And this was the thing. This is the first time in which you have a kind of a conquering people actually trying to document the people that they've conquered. The sad thing, of course, is that what we have today of the Great Library would be if you imagine the whole PVC campus as the Great Library. And the only material we have left is our classroom, because over time it will be destroyed.